Hey, what's going on? This is Chris Camellia with another episode of This Week in PT School I Learned. This past couple weeks, learned a lot, and there's several things that I'm still trying to wrap my mind around, so I think I'm probably going to keep it brief for today. So covering week 5 and 6 in physical therapy school. I'll start week 7. So let's get right to it. Can we talk about hip internal rotation deficits? I've been dying to talk to you guys about hip internal rotation deficits. We have several muscles that help contribute to hip internal rotation, but we don't have one muscle that its primary job is to perform hip internal rotation. Maybe that's because a lot of us might be naturally at our end range in hip internal rotation. Or maybe there's some other reason for it. But it appears that we achieve hip internal rotation as, a coordinated effort of a lot of different muscles working together. So when do you see hip internal rotation? Well, there are some muscles that work. A lot of times when you run, you will internally rotate and externally rotate to achieve a precise kind of running stride. A lot of times as well, in athletes that will perform swinging movements, so you can get some hip internal rotation as you swing. As you can see, my hip internal rotation isn't necessarily the best, but all that kind of serves to illustrate basically where you'll see hip internal rotation. What happens if you don't have adequate hip internal rotation? Well, you'll get rotation maybe from some muscles in your back. Hopefully you don't get too much from any one particular segment. You might also get some rotation from your knee joint, which also isn't really made to rotate that much. And what can happen is if we don't have adequate hip internal rotation and we rely on these other muscles, again, particularly our back and our knees, to perform that rotation, we're going to have a bad time. Those muscles, or those joints, again, our back and our knees, they're not that well made for rotation. What muscles contribute to hip internal rotation? Well, our gracilis, our adductor longus, adductor brevis, adductor magnus, our semitendonosus or semimembranosus, and on the outside we have our gluteus medius, our gluteus minimus, and our tensor fascia lata. So that's 9 different muscles that really make up the majority of hip internal rotation. However, in all the atlases I've looked at, and even in this one study that I'm going to post as well that kind of breaks down the movements of the hip internal rotation isn't the primary function of any of those muscles. So my takeaway is that movement in the transverse plane at the hip is a function of the coordinated actions of all 9 of those muscles, and probably a whole lot of other stuff going on as well. Again, just to summarize, if you don't have a certain movement at one joint, this case, it's our femur on our acetabulum at the hip joint, right? Your hip bone, your thigh bone on your pelvis. If we don't have that movement, we will get that movement, or we will fake that movement using the joints above and below. And the most common injuries, I believe, that you'll see as a result of hip internal rotation deficit will be back injuries, low back injuries in particular, and knee issues. And another takeaway that I get from that is that if you are too far abducted at the hip, again, a lot of those hip internal rotators are adductors. So if you're too far abducted, you might not be giving a lot of those adductors a good length tension relationship to perform their movement that they will perform at the hip, which includes internal rotation. So if you're not in the right place in the frontal plane, that can affect how you perform hip internal rotation. Here's another thing. All three of your ligaments that hold your acetabulum to your femur and vice versa, all three of those ligaments get taut in hip extension. So hip extension, again, when you're running, right, that's hip extension, all right, and so there's a certain point where those ligaments kind of get taut in the front side there, and if we're overextended, if we live in extension, say we stand all day long with our knee back behind us and our pelvis in front of us, that can cause some laxity at our hip joint, and when our hip joint mechanics aren't working as well, trying to keep that ball in that socket, that can cause some other issues as well. So we like to have our ligaments holding the head of the femur to the acetabulum of our pelvis. Our psoas and iliacus are two different muscles. They attach at the same place on the femur, the lesser trochanter of the femur, and they serve to both flex and externally rotate the hip. However, your iliacus is coming off of the basically kind of like all along the iliac crest, the iliac fossa, as well as the anterior sacrum and some of the anterior sacroiliac joint ligaments. And then your psoas muscle is originating at the spine, specifically at T12 to L5. And then it goes to attach to the femur. So your psoas muscle can move your spine. It can side bend it. It can flex it. And if your spine stays stable, that's when your psoas can flex your hip. But it's not the iliopsoas. It's not the one big bad hip flexor that we need to stretch. Our iliacus and our psoas are two different muscles. In fact, the psoas major is segmentally innervated, so the nerves come straight off the spine right into the psoas major, whereas the iliacus is innervated by the femoral nerve. So they're innervated by two different things. So that tells me that we could be using more of our iliacus to flex our hip and less of our psoas major, and vice versa. We could be using less of our iliacus and more of our psoas major, depending on how we're set up, depending on which nerves are firing. I also learned that your anterior cruciate ligament and your posterior cruciate ligament are named based on how they come off of the tibia. So your anterior cruciate ligament originates at the anterior aspect of the intercondylar eminence of the tibia, whereas your posterior cruciate ligament originates at the posterior aspect of the intercondylar eminence of the tibia. The anterior cruciate ligament then travels superiorly and laterally and attaches to the medial surface of the lateral condyle of the femur, whereas the posterior cruciate ligament travels superiorly and medially and attaches to the lateral side of the medial condyle of the femur. Your posterior cruciate ligament basically prevents posterior translation of the tibia on the femur, whereas your anterior cruciate ligament prevents anterior translation of the tibia on the femur. As well, the anterior cruciate ligament can also be taught in extension, whereas the posterior cruciate ligament can be taught in flexion. The other thing I learned about the knee was that the patella, your knee bone, that sesamoid bone that chills within the tendon that is created by the vastus medialis, lateralis, intermedius, and rectus femoris, your quadriceps muscles, the patella does not articulate with the tibia. It only articulates with the femur. So again, that bone that's in your knee doesn't ever slide across your tibia. It just slides across the bottom surface of your femur. So there you go. So that's week 5 and 6. Onward to week 7. And I hope you learned some things. I will post that study that talks about the different movements that occur at the hip. And look forward to hearing from you. And I hope this was helpful.